Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report being recorded on a Columbus Day evening, or I suppose for our Canadian audience, a Thanksgiving Day evening. So, happy Columbus Day and happy Thanksgiving Day to our North American audience, as it were. And then to our Europeans and elsewhere in the world, you know, happy, I guess, Tuesday at this point. So,
No Thanksgiving for you.
no, get back to work, okay?
Mm.
Okay, and look, you will go to work, and then you will come home and play Work Simulator while listening to the War Report. I know how it works in Europe. Okay, I'm an expert on these topics, but this is we're off to a great start. I love these sort of intros, but we have a lot of ground to cover, and I'm sure it will shock none of you. But if you had told me this a week ago, I would have laughed in your face. Uh, we actually have Ukraine as the minor segment of the show, in which case we'll still start out with it just to get out of the way.
Yeah.
So if you'd like to give us just the updates for the past week or so, then by all means.
Y- Yes. So there are no, except for some small changes for the Russians, there are no changes, particularly nothing in Zaporozhye. There was a tiny bit of ground that the Russians took um, west of Verbove, uh, which gave them slightly more control over the second trench line. There was a back and forth in the southern part between Rabotine and Pokrapovka. Pokropovka. Krov. Krov is blood in Russian and Ukrainian, and the Southern Slavic languages, krov becomes krv, which means blood, means new blood. Anyhow,
Mm,
so now uh, last week I said, it was Fab Week. This week, it's Tornado Week. The Russians are striking more deeply. Their Lancets are now improved and do most of the striking that's like mid distance, 40 to 60 kilometers. The ordnance that they carry are slightly more powerful than they were, but close up is FPV drones. A number of centers were taken out last week. Remember, I when we had the boys from World War Now on, I mentioned that Ukrainian television published a hit on a command center in Kharkov on Ukrainian television. I thought, like, why would you do that, right? Well, there was another hit on another command center in Kharkov, another one underground. Apparently, this was the one that was responsible for the attacks on the Belgorod region of Russia, in the Kursk area, um, in the Bryansk area, that area, north of Kharkov. So they were taken out, estimated like 30 to 40 losses of the Ukrainian military, plus probably several officers as well. That's who would be in there, anyways. The Ukrainians did publish this video. Another deep attack took place. Remember in August or maybe very early September, but I think it was in August, Reichart's a hotel where a lot of mercenaries went. And see, the reason the Russians target places where mercenaries go, including the Odessa hotel and the port of Odessa, the city, is because they know that there are going to be NATO personnel there. Either they're going to be retired, you know, officers, generals, or you know, guys, guys who will be killed and it'll be a suicide, or they'll be like low-ranking mercenaries who will go there. So there was another attack in Kharkov that was in the city itself, and it was another Reichart's hotel. Another attack in the town of Groza, again in the Kharkov Oblast, but it's near Kupiansk. Now, remember on the show last week, I said that one of the founders of ADAR was killed. I don't know if this is the same guy. And Russia's diplomat Nezabevia or Nezabegia, like He actually spoke about this today at the UN to clarify what happened because 51 people were killed. No names were released except that he was a nationalist. So him and his son were in Poland. So this might not be the same Adar guy. It might be. I don't know. But from this description, I would lean to say that it was probably not. These guys were in Poland. They came back to fight. They're Ukrainian. They're Ukrainian nationalists. And the father was killed early on, and the son decided to rebury him. So his body was taken out from its location in what other part of Ukraine it was in, and it was buried in the Groza area, which is west of Kupiansk and east of Kharkov. And there were a lot of military personnel there, and the Russians struck this. Apparently, the son of this guy was also getting married. Um, Putin had his Valdai speech, and he did mention an attack that happened this week where he claims that Storm Shadow missiles were destroyed and Scalp missiles. It was Scalp missiles that destroyed the submarine and the landing ship that were in dock for repairs and maintenance in Sevastopol. And of course, Sevastopol was attacked. Sorry, it was a Scalp that was used for the Sevastopol, and I believe the Storm Shadow earlier was used for the ships themselves. Now, the Russians have moved their fleet out of Sevastopol, and a part of them are on the east side of Crimea because they have another naval base there. And the other one is close to the city of Anapa and Gelendzhik. It's on the east side of the Black Sea, and I believe this is in the Krasnodar area. It's north of Sochi, okay, but probably south of Anapa. So um, now that's pretty significant. Obviously the Russians don't want to risk any more ships being destroyed, so they're working from further afield. That hasn't stopped them from, because of course they've moved several kilometers over, but like the missiles that they launch obviously can go for hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. So they did strike again the Odessa Oblast, Ismail and Remy, and another port south of Odessa City. They targeted grain silos. So that is still going on. Another attack by the Russians and for an airport in Nikolaev, a military airport. Yet another Su 27 and I believe a MiG-29 were also taken out. These are the planes. I know the Su-27 can hold the Storm Shadows, and there haven't been that many Storm Shadows since. So far, Crimea has been able to intercept everything. So um, now the Ukrainians, of course, even though they have lost some of their HIMARS, remember that even according to Western sources, they can only fire about 18 HIMARS a day. If you believe the Americans that they haven't lost any HIMAR unit, right? That leaves them, that leaves, let's say 6 times 36 is how many potential firing platforms you would have, but you only launch 18. Now, in 2023, no HIMARS was destroyed from the Americans, but a HIMARS variant, I believe, in the winter was destroyed, although that was German, and it was the tracked version, not the wheeled version, right? Um, in any case, the Russians have been preparing to move ahead into Novomihailovka, which is a town just on the outskirts of Donetsk city in the southwesternly direction. It is northeast of Ugledar. They were going to launch it sooner. However, the Ukrainians found them. They found 2 demining vehicles and destroyed them again with the HIMARS. So that I thought that's I think overall the HIMARS actually they are a very competent piece of kit. Now I've seen Tor and Grad missile launchers survive, but then often they don't survive. More often than not, they don't. But I have seen videos of where they do. Uh, that isn't to take anything away. I think that the HIMARS are very capable, and this goes back to what I was saying about this week an equivalent to the HIMARS. And they have been very successful in attacking several training areas. One in the Nikolaev region, not the city itself, and another more significantly in the Donetsk region, controlled by Ukraine, about 50, 60, 70 kilometers, depending where you might believe the launch came from. And in both instances, the first one, like you see the video footage, and like there's a few dozen, and like these are very powerful strikes. The one in the Donetsk region under Ukrainian control had more men being trained. And I think it's safe to say, like I counted potentially like 60 to 75 people. The hit is pretty bad. You do see, shadows of what are probably human figures. So the loss is pretty significant. But then the Russians themselves got hit by a HIMARS in an area 9.7 kilometers from the front line in Donetsk. So I, you know, I don't know why they wouldn't have trained further back. That's really careless. But the overall tempo, what would I say? I would say that Ukraine is running out of steam right now. Um, the Russians are exerting pressure along the entire front line. So it's not just in Robotino, it's not just in the Vremevsky Ledge area. It's all over, and they've been able to contain the Ukrainians from crossing the railroad line now for like 3 weeks. And there has been no gains in Robotino for the Ukrainians for 2 weeks. The Russians have made some gains in the Svatove direction. They have reached one of the highways. It's a very small gain, but it gives them a certain amount of control over the highway there. That highway goes and links up with Petropavlovka and with Kupiansk. They've made more gains, small gains, towards Kupiansk and Simkovka. Um, I would say that, things might slow down. The rains have started in Ukraine right now. They're not, remember that in the fall, they actually receive slightly less rain than they do in the spring. Time will tell, but I think you can say that the potency, if not the offensive altogether, for the Ukrainians has stopped.
Well, something I would recommend everyone checks out is once again from History Legends. He actually did a very good summary of the failure of the summer offensive that he put out. I think it
Yes,
was
he
on
did.
Thursday or Friday, but once again, I would certainly recommend that everyone check it out. But one thing that stuck with me is, and of course, propaganda is propaganda. You need to say what you need to rile up the troops that are actually going to be in battle. This has happened in every war in document history. But the idea that they were going to cut a line to the Sea of Azov and actually make headway into Crimea is what they were propagandizing not only the soldiers but just the entire support apparatus into believing. Like I said, clearly that wasn't the actual expectation. That is something you say to rally the troops and to get support behind it. I'm under no illusions this happens all the
Yeah,
time in wars. The Russians do the same. Everyone who's ever fought in war has done the same to some degree.
yeah.
But
The other thing he
yeah, go
mentioned,
ahead.
go ahead, go ahead.
Uh, you go ahead.
The other thing he mentioned in that video that I think, for some people, at least on the Zaporozhye front, might indicate that the Russians are probably maybe not correct about overall losses for the Ukrainians, but the ratio. He mentioned the 42nd, the 47th Brigade that is fighting there and their losses. He does a little bit of arithmetic. He's very good at keeping everything, in store. and analyzing it based on like what they Ukrainians have officially said. Our brigade is now at 25%, right? And he extrapolated from several examples, not just one brigade, but several brigades that have been fighting there. He also wisely said that he never believed that like the Robotino theater had 70,000 soldiers at any given time, because that would be even more than Bakhmut. But if you include the entire Zaporozhye ledge, then sorry, the entire southern front, maybe even including Kherson, that's not out of the question. And basically, what he was extrapolating based on the losses, um, he did conclude that it would be somewhere 7-1 to 10-1 ratio for the Russians, because he was very good in documenting. And I he put up that photo I put up last episode of 24 vehicles. Of course, it's much more than 24 vehicles that have attempted to get into Verbove, right? And just a huge number of deaths of Ukrainians in the trenches, right? But yes, go on. I just wanted to mention that. So if people want to check that video out, I think his conclusions are very sound.
Yeah, absolutely. And something else that it reminded me of that is a bit of a tangent, not necessarily related to too much what he said, but he did bring it up, is the absolute disparity in terms of Russian and Ukrainian artillery. And
Yeah,
that just simply because of the amount of Russian artillery, Ukrainian success, especially on an offensive campaign, is nigh impossible. They don't have the guns to back it up. Certainly don't have the air power to back it up, but they definitely don't have the guns to back it up. But I think it was from May of this year. There was an interesting statistic that was floating around that in the collective NATO sphere, as it were, between the different NATO countries, shell production is actually lower in the combined NATO countries, or maybe it was like some of them, but I know it was United States in particular, but I think the entirety of NATO. Shell production is lower than what the Austro-Hungarians were putting out during World War One in 1915,
yes, yeah, yeah,
and I mean, of course, they had a total war economy, but we're talking about one of the weakest powers in Europe at the time that was practically falling apart by the time the war started, was still able to
yeah,
outpace the most industrialized and quote unquote most powerful military in the world in shell production. And
yeah,
once again, when it comes to the actual support, it simply isn't there for Ukraine in terms of that. I mean, they have the manpower, they have the infantry, despite recruitment and conscription issues. They are able to actually build up sizable forces. But when it comes to supporting them, once again, especially in an offensive capability, it's just not there. And
yeah,
even the effort it would take to get there, it would take years to have them competently trained to use the equipment in an offensive capability. And look, I know they've been agitating for F-16s, they've been agitating for more artillery. We've been plundering and pillaging weapons from every second, third world country we can to send to Ukraine. In fact, actually, we plundered Israeli arms and had sent them to Ukraine just a few months before this entire debacle in the Middle East. But that's a side the point for right now.
yeah,
But it's even among the Ukrainian command and, of course, Zelensky, just the Kiev regime and their sponsors, there isn't really a plan going forward. Now, you could make the counter argument and say, "Oh, what's the Russian plan?" Blah blah blah. The Russians have always had some vague notion of a plan that they're going to, as they would say, liberate some territory and neutralize the Ukrainian state as a forward operating base of NATO. In which case, they are maybe at a slower pace than some would like. They are achieving that goal ultimately with the way
yeah,
Ukraine has fared in this war and with the amount of Western support and the way that Western support has been divvied out. But the other point I wanted to make is this is the same country that made a Hollywood trailer for its counteroffensive, saying
yeah, yeah,
we are going to attack here, here, and here. Now, perhaps you could say that Well,
I like
clear.
how they did the little shh with the finger up to the mouth. Don't tell anybody. It's like, why would we tell? You've done nothing but tell everybody for 6 months.
Yeah, it's completely comical. This is just a fundraising drive. And look, making a propaganda video is one thing. Everyone, since the film has been invented, has done that. It's quite effective in some cases. But to that level, and having your high command get on there and talk about where you're going to attack, how you're going to attack. Now, once again, you could say, well, clearly they aren't telling exactly what they're going to do in the video, but even entertaining that notion, even doing something like that, is beyond stupidity. Like I said, if they want to make a cut of like, oh wow, look at how badass the Ukrainians are, and look at the counteroffensive from last year, and we can do it again. That's one thing. You could argue it's a waste of funds, but like I said, propaganda film has existed as long as film has, especially in the context of war. I mean, go back to World War One, World War Two, Vietnam. Just speaking from an American perspective, you can find all of that. But this is beyond, just beyond stupidity. I haven't seen anything like this before when it
Yeah,
comes to this, and you'll notice they've been doing this since January of this year, since the beginning of this year.
yeah.
In January, it was the winter offensive. When it rolled around to March and April, it was the spring offensive. Became the summer offensive as we rolled into July, in which case I would say actually over the summers when we did see the most action, but that was just them throwing themselves into what was a pretty strong Russian line of defense to the point where they didn't even penetrate the first line of defense. Yeah,
Remember
villages.
what the Institute for the Study of War said about this
What
last
what did it
week?
what did it say about that? I missed it.
They said, we believe Putin has ordered his troops
Oh, that
to
one.
to protect the gray zone before the first line of defense in order to prove that the funding from NATO countries has been insufficient in creating uh, outcomes for the Ukrainians. It's like, okay, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, and like, I don't know what it like. Is that like, oh my God, you won't believe what evil Putin did? Like,
See,
but
the
the best
Russians
explainer
faked a
I've
victory by holding a
yeah,
line of defense.
yes,
That's a fake
they
victory.
shouldn't have done that.
No, no.
They shouldn't have done that.
They should have sent them
But
into the Ukrainian line of defense aimlessly. That's how you achieve victory, and that is
But the best
directly from the NATO
explainer I've
handbook.
ever heard for why they went on with that campaign, which included, the Hollywood trailer, is this. I can't remember who said it. I think it was a boomer. He said, Larry Bird at his peak was really something else to watch. And this is like my era. I was a kid, when the Celtics were like, the best team in basketball. And one of the things he would do is he would like literally tell the guy that was, guarding him of the opposite team, he said, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and then I'm going to do a 3-pointer. And then he would do it, right? It would be just this intimidation tactic. It would be to completely demoralize his opponent. And I think that's what the Ukrainians were doing with that. They wanted to completely demoralize them. It was part of their psychological warfare campaign, right? It's hopeless for you. You're not gonna stop us. You're gonna crumble like last year. And I think that kind of explains it.
Yeah, that's the closest thing I've heard to a rational explanation for it. Like I said, it does explain it, but also at the same time, it does have its glaring flaws. But like I said, it is the best explanation I have heard for it. But what's next? And I don't want to get too
Well,
I don't want to get too much into it right now. But we'll get into some Middle Eastern stuff later. But now you have another major situation that has completely diverted. Probably the one country that would be able to divert America's attention from Ukraine right now is in its own crisis. So you have that, and not to mention you have the rhetoric from this year, from the beginning of this year, talking about how it might be time to try to
yeah,
lean on Kiev into negotiation.
I've
Zelensky is
seen
on the
so many more
ropes.
articles.
Um, yeah, I've seen them too. Zelensky's on the ropes. You've had several ministers resign. You've had uh, I think it was Illusion who was dismissed. Yeah, because they brought in the Tatar Mongol defense minister who is certainly going to own the Moskals. I'm sure you all remember. But you've had just this complete cleaning of house. the absolute last thing you would want for a wartime government, as it were, is what you're getting now. Zelensky has been more or less radio silent in all of this. Now, I think the last thing he had was actually around the time of the Yaroslav Hunka thing, where he
Yeah.
was giving his speeches, but then of course that got eclipsed by the bad optics moment in Ottawa, as it were. But
Yeah.
he's been silent. He knows the score, and he probably, if even if it's not the case, he probably believes there's real chance that his time has come, and even if he does get to go and live a nice life in exile in some western city, maybe not so much Tel Aviv these days. He knows that he will go down in history as the Ukrainian president who failed to beat back the Russians and was replaced by somebody else. Now, whether that come in the form of a coup or a quote unquote election that they hold under a ceasefire in 2024 or whatever, because I mean, Zelensky is, we all know what kind of man he is. But the question is he willing to go to those lengths to hold on to power for himself, or is he going to take the golden parachute? And judging on how he has conducted this war and what I know about him and his just life and political career, I think he's inclined to take the golden parachute and live like somebody like Saakashvili has, and be the NGO talking mouthpiece, as it were.
Yeah, he'll probably move to Florida or something. Um,
Get a job in the DeSantis campaign.
this reminds me of a few things. There have been on the Hunka story some more developments, right? Uh, there were articles that tried to obfuscate like who the Galician SS Waffen was, and all of these guys had to pledge allegiance to Adolf Hitler, right? Um, and actually, they spent most of their time exterminating Poles.
Yeah, they had a total of one engagement with the Russians in which they were completely routed.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The other thing is Hunka. That was not his first time at Parliament. He was there in 2007, and yeah, yeah. This idea that they didn't know, I just can't. I still can't believe that they did it. I think they count on just like how uneducated like the public is about history. Maybe that's why they did it. Um, and then they tried to blame the Russians. Uh, like for a disinformation campaign. It's like, where you've destroyed, you've censored all their media. Like, where would people learn about this? um the other thing is Victoria. See, Hunka also had an endowment at the Alberta University in Edmonton for $30,000, and that has been retracted. um I've actually been to a strange little plaque memorial of where Ukrainians before or after World War One, because like they were not like this. They were like back then before World War Two. They were actually very pro-Russian, but Canada had these work camps that were brutal. The men couldn't leave the camps, and like my friend and I actually went for a drive in the mountains. It's around like it's between Lake Louise and Banff, and we found it. We found this plaque. I have pictures of it. I maybe one time I'll send them to you. But
Yeah, but just as
anyways, a
an
lot of these
aside,
guys perished in these work camps. In any case, Victoria Freeland, like you know, in her youth, she took like Russian and Slavic studies. She was there. She went to the Soviet Union. She worked with the American embassy. She got her start in the press. Her uncle, who was a relative on the grandfather's side, that ran like this like this Nazi newspaper that took over from a Polish newspaper.
Oigvalt.
Yeah, and she's mentioned in the forward an article that he wrote from 1996. So like This stuff is actually well documented if people if people want to find out. And then in 97, 60 Minutes did a whole episode about, and you can see what the tactics were, right? Like, okay, World War II is over. We need people to infiltrate the Soviet Union. So we'll get these guys to do it, right? Some of the other guys, well, they have to die.
Yeah, I
But
mean, this is just classic Gladio stuff. I don't think
yeah,
it's really treading. A lot of people
that's all
actually
this
don't know
is.
about it,
Like
but
people
yeah,
act like this is new history or something. But um, the other thing I wanted to mention was Ben Wallace visited Kiev and he had an op-ed. This idiot is retired, and his op-ed was titled "Ukraine is winning. Let's finish the job." I he bemoaned that the average soldier for Ukraine right now is in his early
yeah,
40s.
yeah. I remember we got into that a little bit last episode with Ben Wallace
Yes,
and
that's right. That's
his
right.
adventures to
What a
Kiev.
scumbag. So he's basically asking for to draft the youth, and the Rada is like pushing for raising the conscription age to 65. Now, 16-year-olds in Ukraine, males cannot leave, and the first summons for female conscription have been handed out. But these are just women who, at the moment, who have a background in medicine,
Yeah,
right? They
at
can't
least
leave.
not yet. They're
Even
not going to be.
pharmaceuticals, they can't leave.
They're not going to be put in combat. They're going to be put in
Yeah,
auxiliary roles. But I mean, once
yeah,
again, when the situation gets desperate enough, if the Kiev regime is that willing to try to win this war, it will come to women in combat arms. And
yeah.
there's never been any illusion about it. They were talking about it even before the war started, back in February 2022, just weeks before the war started. And also, I hate to keep teasing it, but you also have this case in Israel where, oh, the women have to serve in the conscript armies too because we're a nation of citizen soldiers surrounded by enemies. Blah 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 blah. Once again, all this stuff that we've heard before, but Kiev is desperate enough if they do get the opportunity where they will throw every able-bodied individual into the front lines, and I think we've seen that considering the fact. And now, early 40s isn't that absurd when it comes to age on the front lines, but you're getting to you're getting into absurd territory. Like maybe a few years after that, like talking late 40s, 50s, is when people start to ask questions. And once again, the justification is we don't want to squander the youth of the country, even though we
Yeah.
also simultaneously won't let them leave because we will issue summons for conscriptions when they do turn 18. And I mean that's what they're at right now. And as the situation gets more desperate, if they are allowed to, if they are not
They're
strong
creating
armed,
orphans,
oh,
basically.
absolutely. If they are not strong armed into some sort of agreement or some sort of ceasefire, this will be the path they take because they have shown, that is the current regime in Kiev, that they are willing to go to these lengths. And look, even when it comes to this, do you think Zelensky cares that much about the Ukrainian ethnos? Even if you had some like dyed in the wool Galician nationalist in the office of the presidency of Ukraine or just in the government office in general, and not this rootless cabal that's currently in power. Look, I mean, they have their myriad of problems, and certainly we've seen that play out on the front lines. We've seen that play out in a lot of these more quote unquote right wing militias. But even they would have a sense of ethnic solidarity where they wouldn't want to send these men to the meat grinder. Where somebody like Zelensky, he's fully willing to do that. The man is an actor by trade. He's fully willing to play the part to his own end and really to the ends of his people in a broader sense. In which case, that's also going to get him into some interesting territory in the next few weeks here. But the next move forward for Ukraine is it's maybe not this year, but next year, as it were, is going to be getting everyone they can into combat arms. And once again, that also does not address the problem. Sure, they can rally the manpower to build infantry, as it were, but when it comes to the artillery, when it comes to the air power, when it comes to the support that an infantry needs, even to conduct basic defensive operations, that is severely lacking. And that is something that is continuing to lack. That is something that the West I guess to their credit, is dragging their feet on when it comes to providing Ukraine with aid such as armor, aircraft, artillery, etc. Simply because in a lot of places they're just tapped out of reserves and they don't want to tap into what their active militaries are using.
Hmm.
But uh, the next play here is either quite literal human wave attacks, or they are pressed into some sort of position where they actually have to sit down and maybe make some concessions, actually maybe negotiate on real
Hmm.
terms. Whereas, look, I'm not saying Russia is willing to go into a full war economy. I'm not saying Russia's ready for general mobilization. By no means am I saying that. But once again, you do see in preliminary polls when it comes to issues keep people care about, because Russia does actually have an election in a few months. That's going to be in March 2024. That people are less averse to another mobilization wave than they are to concessions in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And
The Russian MOD has said that they are not going to have another mobilization
yeah,
and don't see.
I don't.
I mean, like I said, I've always thought, or I've thought for a long time now, that the Russians don't have the ammunition to supply a million man army. It's
Oh no,
it's not
no.
there. And I saw a Russian video that shows like reserves. So from the beginning of the war till now, and I mean, I won't give you the screen caps, but at the beginning of the war, the Russians are outnumbered like 1 to 2.5. Then it's 1 to 2 this time last year. And then now it's like almost 1 to 1. The Ukrainians still have roughly 200,000 more men. And this counts everybody, okay? Reserves, non-combatants, like we're talking, right? So it doesn't include combatants, but the Ukrainian army still has more that are pressed into service than the Russians do. Not by a lot, because both of them have figures that are close to about a million. But remember, that's not all combatants, so it's quite a bit less than that.
Yeah, basic
Um,
tooth to tail ratio stuff.
but and if I I don't know if you had a chance to see it, maybe I forgot to even send it to you, but it was a small clip with Arestovich and Gordon, um, and like Arestovich is such a sneaky guy, man.
Oh, he's my favorite.
He is a Palpatine without like a Death Star. He is really something extraordinary. So this is a clip from a conversation that they have, and he even talks very early on about how he could be thrown in jail. But he says to him, "I'll tell you what, how things are going to go." And he says, because of these 4 reasons, the 4 reasons have to do with corruption, bad idea, bad decision making, bad alliances, this sort of thing. This is what Ukraine didn't do right. And he says, you notice that all the pressure at the moment is how corrupt Ukraine is, and our backers are backing off, right? They're going to force us to make a deal with the Russians where we will have to concede land. And Gordon says, "Well, I don't think Zelensky is going to sign that." And he said, and Aristotle says, "Based on his actions, I don't see him doing that." And so Gordon says, "Well, how is this going to happen?" He says, "Elections." And he says, "Well, Ukraine can't have elections during the middle of a war." And he goes, "America had elections during the Civil War. Lincoln held them." And then Gordon is just gobsmacked. He goes back in his chair, his mouth opens. He can't believe this. And he says, what if Zelensky wins?" He goes, "Well, that's an unknown. But the Americans, particularly in 2024, are going to press for elections." And this could be why Zelensky has thrown Kolomoisky in jail, and why um, he has decided to open up an investigation into Zelensky's performance in the South and why he lost Zaporozhye and Kherson so early on in the war, right? Because he wants to make him a completely unpalatable candidate for the presidency.
Oh,
Right. So,
absolutely. And
so
I
I,
also will point out precedent in terms of Ukrainian elections. I think to date, since Ukrainian independence in '91, the only president to ever win re-election is Yanukovych, and that was a few months later. He was completely driven out of the country.
yeah.
Other than that, it's just been a complete cycling through. And I mean, you're. I suppose Arestovich is right when it comes to the fact that yeah, you can have elections in an active war. The U.S. did it in its largest war in its history, so
Mm.
it's not unheard of. And you really do have to question the integrity of that. Actually, you can never question the integrity of an election process, even under those circumstances. Excuse me. And yeah, it is a big question mark if Zelensky wins because that depends. Can he maintain the confidence of his sponsors, both at home and abroad? In which case, I think that is probably the biggest question hanging over the election. Now, I don't know of any potential challengers who would be able to displace him. Now, I would love to see Arestovich. I think he'd be a very entertaining option. Even though, frankly, I'd rather have Arestovich replace Putin. I think he's on something there. But uh, well, remember what he said. You know, once we win this war, we'll unite with the Russians and the Belarusians and crush the toy armies of Europe. His words,
Well,
not mine. But
yes, yes, yes. Now, I mean, there's an element of truth in that. The West does not want you like they want Ukraine to win, but they don't want Ukraine to be strong afterwards.
oh, absolutely not. They want it to be one of these backwater Eastern European vassals, and that will get a token amount of economic development, similar to levels of, say, Poland or Croatia, or the maybe not the Czech Republic, because the Czech Republic's doing remarkably well for itself given its circumstances. Okay, like Slovakia, but once again, look at places like Eastern Poland and Eastern Slovakia. Look at places like rural Croatia. Their living standards are about on par with what you have in the rest of the former Eastern Bloc. Outside
Hmm.
of the major population centers, which are coming to first world standards, you do have, once again, in the smaller towns in the country, you have that same post Soviet stagnation. And Ukraine was actually one of the worst examples of post Soviet stagnation when it came to standard of living. In fact, Ukraine has not achieved a standard of living. It has not achieved the same standard of living it had since the fall of the Soviet Union. Whereas in Belarus, things have mostly stabilized. I'm not saying that they're doing great for themselves. In Russia, certainly, they've had a remarkable recovery given their circumstances, especially without the
Hmm.
1990s. You do have, once again, these other former Eastern Bloc states like Poland, Croatia, Slovenia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, that have, Hungary for that matter, that have gotten an immense amount of European Union aid, in which case they've been able to develop. But like I said, that's a very patchwork thing in those countries. You go to some part of it, it feels like it's still 1989. And I'm not speaking from personal experience, I'm speaking just from what I've read about it and the conversations I've had with people from this part of the world. And I'm sure you could probably actually attest more to this having been over there, certainly more than I have. But
Yeah.
some parts of the country, it does feel like the modern day. Other parts, it feels like 1989. And I
Hmm.
know it was they would always write these articles, and I don't know about 5, 10 years ago about Belarus being the quote unquote last remnant of the Soviet Union where things really did start to stagnate there. Life isn't terrible by standard of living, especially compared to a lot of parts of the world, but it is stagnant. And in which case, that's actually where you get a lot of fertile ground for these color revolutions because there are legitimate problems on the ground. In which case, you send the right people over there. You send the people with enough
Yeah, the
charisma over there. You build
agitprops
up
and
these you build up these figures who start with legitimate concerns, but then tend to spiral into more and more ridiculous things until you have something like the Maidan or these other color revolutions.
Mhm. I do have, you mentioned Yanukovych, and I do have a correction to make. A few months ago, I mentioned that why did the US press for a color revolution in Ukraine so badly when the Russian lease on Sevastopol ran out in 2017? So my brother, I was just talking about it in passing, and my brother, who is my replacement, said, what are you talking about, 2017? Yanukovych signed a deal for another 50 years. I go, oh my God. Like, I completely forgotten about that.
Yeah, I'm sure I've
So
heard it
that might have
before,
been
but
another
yeah.
motivating factor for this. It's never mentioned, but that might have been another motivating factor for spearing on the color revolution in Kiev in 2014 was because they saw it like, oh my God, like what the lease is going to, I don't know, 2060 what? That no, we can't have that.
And mind you, under Yanukovych, when it came to Russian European relations, they almost struck the golden compromise where Ukraine would not join NATO. It would be militarily neutral. It would be allowed in the European Union, but would still maintain a strong economic tie with Russia. And this was at the time when France and Germany, in particular,
Yeah.
were becoming very economically integrated with Russia. Which case, that was all throughout the 2000s. And sure, you had the upset in Georgia, but this is something that the U.S. State Department generally feared was a cohesive bloc of
Yes.
European states from France to Germany to Russia, the Paris, Berlin, Moscow axis, which they harped on about in the 2000s, early 2010s, that they really did fear that as a power bloc marginalizing American influence in Europe. And frankly, they had
And frankly, marginalizing Poland.
oh, absolutely. um, but I mean, I'm not going to sit here and defend the European Union, but Ukraine militarily neutral outside of NATO, but as an EU member state at that time, but also as part of the Eurasian Economic Union, they would have been a very prosperous middleman country, which would have been yet another ground for closer Russian European cooperation, which was completely unacceptable for Washington. So that was also, I think, part of the reason that they had pushed for the color revolution as well at the time.
Hmm.
Yeah, a lot of people forget the direction of Putin's foreign policy pretty much up until 2014, even after they tried what they did in Georgia, and that you had the Russian intervention in Georgia, the Abkhazia and South Ossetia wars. There was still that level of cooperation. You didn't really see sanctions about that, but it was up until 2014 because they knew that they had to start pulling uh, out the more drastic measure, which is why we have this, which is really the entire origin of this war. A lot of people, even on our side, aren't even privy to that information, but and that's what it really came down to. And for the time being, it does seem that they have severed that bridge, but yeah, once again, getting back to the point of a post Zelensky Ukraine, I would say it's a very real possibility. And of course, although I do certainly believe that there will never be any fraud in any elections, that due to the wonderful support of Western democracies and, let's just say, elements that are pro liberalism and democracy inside Ukraine, they will be able to rally enough of a grassroots base to have Zelensky legitimately lose an election in 2024. And that's what I do think it's going to come to. And as for who they get, I, I crazy that I'm giving Arestovich credit here, but I do think they're going to try to push forward somebody who can actually save face negotiations and look for an off ramp in this conflict.
It's very possible.
For
I
the time
mean,
being,
the
that is, I should add.
for the time. See, the thing is remember when the war started, I said ideally what Russia would want is for Ukraine to have a civil war, and that the winning side is the side that Russia wants, right? And in effect, the funding for Ukraine to fight Russia also staves off the possibility of Ukraine having a civil war. Um, if they went to elections next year, the possibility of a civil war would increase dramatically. Now, if they get very low funding, I think that will exacerbate the situation, right? And would America want that, right? The difficult part now will be how much funding will Biden give to Ukraine, right? Because a lot of the problems, which naturally would arise from lack of let's say, abilities of the Ukrainians, right? Like they're able to function like this because of the immense amount of funding. Those problems would arise very quickly, and divisions would set in very quickly as well. So, you know, my guess is he wants to give them enough money that for 2024 they don't have to worry about Ukraine.
Yes.
They have other stories that are going to dominate. They've got it all lined up. It could still even be Israel. It may not be. but the big story that's going to dominate for 2024 will be the election. Like Biden doesn't want Ukraine hanging over him for his reelection campaign, if he's even going to run. Like, I know he's going to run, but the man is debilitating very quickly before our eyes. Does that mean Gavin Newsom will step in? I don't know.
One
In
of my
any
favorite
case,
schizoid theories on the 2024 election, courtesy of what's his name, Joel Gilbert, who, if any of you are familiar, he is an independent documentary maker who just, let's say, makes some very interesting films. He made one about the Trayvon Martin case that is unironically good that I would recommend. He also made some about like the Iran stuff, which I mean takes like the standard conservative line, but is very fascinating in its own right. In which case, I would certainly recommend it in that regard. Like I said, they're odd, they're bizarre in many ways, but I do think that the guy is sharp. One thing that he keeps insisting on, I don't agree with it, but it's one of those bizarre, fascinating things, once again, that I feel the need to bring up, is that Michelle Obama is going to be the dark horse candidate in 2024. Like I said, I don't believe it, but dumber things have happened.
yes, yes, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, but like a Newsom, certainly Kamala Harris has the charisma of a wet blanket, so that's maybe she'll continue being vice president, but in terms of that, I don't know, maybe Blinken. I doubt they would put Blinken somewhere like that. He doesn't exactly have the chops, as it were. I mean, Newsom's really the only one that they could probably pull out like that. Um, certainly not RFK Jr. I don't. I think the Democratic love affair with the Kennedys is probably over at this point. But that's I, I feel silly even bringing him up. But yeah, in terms of it, I mean, if Biden does have the mental and physical capabilities to run, he will. But I could very easily see him being sidelined, especially considering the fact that, once again, it'd probably be around the time of the Republican primaries, around the time of the conventions, when the Republicans get their man, whether it's, let's be honest, Trump or DeSantis. There's not really many other options when it comes to that, in which case, if Trump is still walking free, it's gonna be him. I think everyone with any degree of foresight can agree on that. But you're right; they don't want Ukraine hanging over the head. Preferably, they would like some sort of either success in Ukraine or some sort of peace deal where they can come and say Biden is a great mediator, a great negotiator who was able to quell one of the largest conflicts since the end of World War II. Now they're not going to get that. Don't get me wrong, but they would love to have it. And
Hmm, hmm.
it also the Republicans have a great platform either way in terms of that, because they can either complain about we're too involved in Ukraine or not involved enough, depending on whatever position that the incumbent takes, that Biden takes, as it were. Because
Yes.
if Biden comes home with some sort of peace deal, they're going to treat it like the Iran deal and say tear it up, look at how much we've empowered Russia and how we abandoned Ukraine, blah blah blah. But if Biden is still supplying more HIMAR missiles for the 2024 summer offensive, it's going to be, well, our own border is unsecure. Why are we giving all these weapons and funds to Ukraine? So either way, it's going to be there's going to be a way to oppose it. And even like, especially people like Trump and DeSantis, they could very easily take either position.
Yes.
But that's all I had on the topic for Ukraine for the time being. Suppose if you have any miscellaneous. But oh yeah, actually one last thing I was going to bring up on Ukraine, in terms of the
Hmm.
actual conflict versus the dynamics in America, is just looking at the recent centuries in the region. I'm referring mainly to the conflict, the overarching conflict between the Tsardom of Russia and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They would fight for 5 years. They would have a treaty of eternal peace for 5 years, and it would go back and forth. Go back and forth. The Cossacks would revolt. The Russians would support it. The Cossacks would march on Moscow. The Poles would support it. Once again, it was a very fluid dynamic. These villages went back and forth. In fact, actually, a lot of the way this war has been fought in the gray zone is very reminiscent of these centuries old
Mm,
conflicts,
good point.
where these small, like, people talk about, oh, like, oh, who cares that the Russians and Ukrainians took the small village? I mean, that's the way they've been fighting these wars for years, because these villages have very fickle loyalties. They will be Ukrainian
Hmm,
one day and they
hmm.
will be Russian the next. I can't blame them for that, given how tumultuous their history is. The fact that they're willing to just go along and get along. We're Russian today, we're Ukrainian tomorrow, we're Russian next week. And like I said, I don't fault them at all for that kind of thing. And
Hmm.
but I still believe that that same dynamic does apply because although technology has changed, although culture has changed, I don't think the fundamental dynamics of the region in that sense have changed. In which case, you will continue to get this until you get the domination of one power, which case that's probably going to be Russia unless NATO is willing to actually push all the way into committing to full scale war, which I don't think they're willing to. But I think, and I do think that's also keeping Russia in these on and off wars and these low intensity conflicts, much like they did in Syria, much like they did in Iraq, is something that Washington would see as an acceptable, at least I would say, solution in the medium term, as it were.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very good insight about, the loyalties and everything.
But that's all I had for the Ukraine news and just the overall front and speculations on its short to medium term future. If you want to get into the big the big nothing ever happens this weekend. Because as we know,
Yes.
nothing, indeed nothing ever does happen, and this is no exception. Of course, I don't know what you're talking about. Hamas is calling for peace negotiations already, so clearly nothing has happened. But for to go over the details of the nothing, as it were, it was on Saturday, Shabbat, as our friends in Israel would call it. That and keep in mind, Israel is like probably the only place in the world where, okay, outside of Hasidic communities in New York, where religious Jews actually do take Shabbat to like its like most serious extreme, the way the Jews have throughout their history, like in terms of everything shut down, everyone goes home, everyone goes to the synagogue. So you have Hamas launch an offensive into southern Israel from the Gaza Strip, in which case they take more land in one day than the Ukrainians take in the entire summer counteroffensive, just to put it in perspective. And they are using their regular guerrilla tactics with the bottle rockets. They decided to use ultralight gliders and drop grenades from those, and fire on Israelis from those as well. Once again, very the kind of things that you would expect from a place like Gaza, the kind of warfare innovations that it's their only choice. They want to wage war, and I think something towards the end of the weekend. Now, it's impossible to tell. The Israeli claim death toll was up to about 700 by the end of the weekend.
For now, the last I
Yeah, go
heard,
ahead.
okay, the Israelis claim that they have lost 900 to 1,000 people. That was this morning, the morning of here on the other side of the Atlantic, um, and about 649. That's both these numbers are going to go up, obviously, right? But it's the first time ever I have seen more Israelis get killed than Palestinians. Usually it's 100 to 1.
Oh, absolutely. And we've even seen the Israeli response, or at least the beginning of the Israeli response, with the strikes on Gaza. It's what you would expect. It is a complete indiscriminate bombing campaign. It is uh, the the usual, the standard fare that we saw in 2021, that we saw in
Mm-hmm.
2018, that we saw in 2014. Except this time, the IDF, the quote unquote Israeli Defense Force, has mobilized 100,000 troops along Gaza's border. And I
Mm-hmm.
think most interestingly is that they mobilized 100,000 men. Now, of course, the Israelis love to pride themselves on everyone does their 2 years of military service. It's a mandatory conscription, including the women, and women are at least trained for combat. But notice when there's actual war on the horizon, when it looks like they're actually going to put boots on the ground in Gaza, it's a force of 100,000 men, which I think shows the level of seriousness they're taking this with.
Yeah, they're
It
saying, including reserves, they're up to
yes,
300,000.
and that's also on top of skirmishes along the border of southern Lebanon. Now, those of you who have a sharp memory or who have an interest in recent history in the region will recall the 2006 intervention into southern Lebanon against Hezbollah. That ended very poorly for Israel. The casualties mounted, the families were outraged at the loss of life, and the campaign was quickly ended, and Lebanon has been in what is more or less a status quo since '06, because that was around the time that the Syrian forces were withdrawing, shortly before their own civil war in Syria, that is. In which
Mhm.
case, you did also have, and I'll get into it a little bit as it were, you did have that drone attack in Syria as well, just a few days before this. And that had up to like 270 casualties, and that was completely memory hold by this. And I'll get into some of that. Not to mention, you also had the skirmish of the Turkish drone with the, I think it was American F-18. Point being, American aircraft shot
Mhm.
down a Turkish drone over Syria as well. In which case, like I said, I'll get into that later. Some of the news about Syria later, but focusing primarily on Israel. You have these attacks. Now, of course, uh, Hamas, king of bad optics, as it were. They are. I mean, they're the ideal opponent for Israel. They are everything that they say the Palestinians are. It's and you go back to the history. You go back to the 1980s. They actually did promote Hamas as the primary group of Palestinian political and let's just say militant representation of the Gaza Strip for a reason. It gives them more or less carte blanche whenever they decide to make their bad optics moves. And of course, you had the Eternal Liberal. They decided to have some sort of hippie music festival on the Israeli
Mm,
Gaza border.
it's so dystopian. Imagine
Eh,
having, like, even if war never broke out, imagine having a fucking stupid techno rave. Like, I can't even believe these stupid things are still popular, right? With these stupid degenerates going to this thing. On the other side is like the largest open air prison ever. It's so dystopian. It's so stupid and dystopian. It's this, we're going to pretend it's like this is a normal country. It's not.
yes, and even the German woman that they say was a casualty was once again was also a dual German-Israeli citizen, which I'm sure will
Yeah, yeah.
shock any of you who have been listening to this program for any amount of time. But okay, you have that, and of course there's casualties from that because once again, much like the affluent liberals who like to go on biking trips through the mountains of Uzbekistan, they get they meet people who, let's just say, are less tolerant of their lifestyle and decide to express that in very creative ways for the for the sake
Yeah.
of making it palatable for more sensitive ears and for our YouTube overlords, as it were. So, of
Right.
course, that happened. They still do have hostages, and you had Netanyahu come out almost immediately saying this is a state of war. Hamas has declared war on us. Blah blah blah. You had, of course, the token statements by Hamas, like, okay, we had our fun, we're ready to negotiate now. In terms of how true that is, I don't know. But you've also seen operations in the West Bank as well cracking down. Now, keep in mind, the West Bank has been mostly pacified for the past 50 years, okay? Uh,
Hmm.
Now, situation and living conditions there aren't nearly as bad as Gaza, but it's still. The West Bank is not a fun place to live, as it were. Uh, Israeli checkpoints, settlements
Yeah.
building more and more, and they've also been completely defanged of any armed resistance insofar as, say, like that you actually do have in Gaza with the situation and Hamas. And I'll I'll go out on a limb. I will say it. I do think there was some sort of deliberate oversight on the side of the Israeli government and the Mossad when it came to this. I think it was just what they were looking for. I think it was just the bait they wanted to set because you had the situation, and this might be a bit of a stretch. Perhaps I'm a little bit off base here. If I am, you, the audience, tell me if do you think I'm off base here. You have one of the largest ethnic cleansings in the past 30 years take place a few weeks ago in the Caucasus. You had the Armenians expelled en masse from Nagorno-Karabakh from Artsakh, and their situation is still up in the air. A lot of them are still in Azerbaijan because the Armenian state is dragging its feet on letting these people in because Pashinyan knows that these people are not going to take favorably to him and his government that more or less left them to the wolves. And the world didn't say a thing about that. Nobody cared. And once again, that's in no small part thanks to the completely compromised government in Yerevan under Pashinyan, who made no effort to help his co-ethnics abroad. In which case, that left none of the world, whether that be the Russians, the Iranians, the Western powers, with any recourse towards these areas, because at that point, Pashinyan had already run up the white flag. And the militia groups in Artsakh weren't going to fight back. But getting back to the topic of Israel Palestine, I know that this is a conflict that has the ability just to capture the world's attention, much unlike in the Caucasus, where a lot of the world just overlooked it. But you have the precedent for a mass expulsion of a minority ethnic group from Azerbaijan, supported by Israel, no less.
Hmm. Hmm.
And not a single shot had been fired in terms of any of that on either side. Now, of course, you did have the brief 2020 war, in which case that sort of sealed the fate of Artsakh, but you didn't even have, in this recent example, any sort of resistance to that. But you have, of course, Hamas all of a sudden, being the kings of bad optics as they are, decide to charge into Israel without any real plan. It's not like they're going to be able to mount an offensive. Sure, they might be able to raid some armories because Israel does keep the civilian armories. Because, as we had said, you have every citizen is as part of the IDF for 2 years, and then of course they can be called upon in a reservist sense when they need to bolster their forces. So sure, you get to raid a few armories, you get to take a few hostage, whatever. You get to do what the things that you've been doing for the past 30 years. But what's your plan to hold this ground? What's your plan to actually strike a blow to the confidence of the Israeli state? What did they expect this to have some sort of domino effect where the Egyptians or Jordanians and Syrians would mount a three-front war like they would have in 1973? I don't even think they wanted to do that because, once again, Hamas, their political loyalties outside of Palestine are very fickle. Now, keep in mind, at the beginning of the Syrian civil war, they were fighting against Assad. They've made their peace. They've had their truce with them since. They're on good terms with the Iranians, but also a lot of people are saying this was directed by Iran because, of course, Iranian funds were unfrozen by the White House a few weeks ago, whatever. On top of that, but Hezbollah has not striked into Israel, and if Iran is really activating its proxies for an all-out war with Israel, you figured that you would have Hezbollah conducting offensive operations right now out of southern Lebanon. Now, you did have, as I said, you had some Israeli military activity in southern Lebanon, but it pales in comparison to whatever happened in 2006 up there. You haven't seen anything out of that yet.
Hmm.
But I'm thinking that some element within Hamas, perhaps by an agent provocateur from the Israeli side, decided that this was a good idea. That, hey, if we do this now, it'll create a chain reaction that will actually accomplish our goal. That will actually drive the Zionists out of Palestine, as they would say. Then we can do it. In which case, I do think that Netanyahu, being beleaguered by internal politics as he is with this entire judicial reform thing, with the world's attention on another major conflict in Europe, and with just the situation in the Middle East in general turning very unfavorable to the Zionist project, with Saudi Arabia and Iran coming to some sort of agreement, facilitated by China no less. And I know China and Israel have their very odd relationship. But once again, Israel is being marginalized on all fronts. So if some sort of crisis were to happen where a strong Israeli state can launch a response, a all-out war response against the Palestinians, and perhaps spilling over into places like Lebanon or Syria, then that in a way does reassert themselves. That does show that they are a serious power that is willing to stand their ground in the face of, let's just say, a region that is growing more and more hostile to their existence. Not that Israel has ever had peace with its neighbors, not in no small part, because of their own actions. Don't get me wrong here, but you already had the Saudis. Now, the Saudis did not sever the current negotiations with Israel. That was a false report, but Saudi Arabia has come out and saying that it's standing with the Palestinian people and that they want a de-escalation of the conflict. Once again, the sort of the middle road that you take in these sort of situations when you're a country like Saudi Arabia. But undoubtedly, it has undone years of progress in backdoor deals
Yeah, all
and underground.
normalization
Yeah,
talks are off.
yeah, and at that point, like I said, it's completely frozen. They all normalization talks are off. Now, granted, they haven't undone progress yet, but at the very best, it's a standstill between Israel and Saudi Arabia, countries that were growing remarkably close up until about the last year or so. And I know Egypt has bided its time, and Egypt has held its tongue on this. They have um, they have toyed with the idea of opening a corridor out of Gaza for the civilian population there, and also setting up, I believe, one of the Palestinian political organizations, not the PLO, it's not Hamas, but it's one of the other political organizations operating out of Gaza, wanting to set up headquarters in Egypt, which is not unprecedented at all. But once again, Israel and Egypt have a very shaky peace that has been upheld since, once again, the 1980s. But it does take really one event to trip that wire. And I know the Egyptians, especially under Sisi's government, are very pragmatic about these sort of situations. But if they see an opportunity to increase their own position at the expense of Israel, with presumably the green light of, say, Russia and China in the face of a more impotent United States, I think they might take that. But like I said, that's a bit out of the realm of this discussion here. That's just speculating into what the near future might be. But as a response to this, of course, the U.S. has released, I think, something to the tune of $9 billion in aid as a result of this, and has also sent a carrier group to the Eastern
Hmm.
Mediterranean to posture against the current conflict. Now, a lot of the usual suspects here are trying to tie this back to Iran, and I'm not saying that it wasn't tied back to Iran, but the timing doesn't make any sense, and the lack of Hezbollah's actions, especially simultaneously, also does not make any sense. Like I said, I'm sure the Iranians. Look, I do believe the Iranian government when they say that they no longer want an Israeli state. I don't think that's just hot air. But I think the circumstances in which these attacks were carried out and the circumstances in which everything played out suggest that Tehran was not orchestrating current events.
I sent you a picture of who I think is orchestrating these events.
Oy vey, let's see who this could be.
Yeah, maybe you should maybe you should post it.
Oh no, you're right. Hold on, let me get this up. Of course it's him. He's so dastardly. Crimea wasn't enough. Kherson wasn't enough. And
What a dastardly villain.
what else would a supervillain want for his birthday than total chaos? And you know what? Let me just get Telegram up here because I will show you the image. If this would ever load. Welcome back to the technical difficulties. It really does feel like we're back in 2018. Israel Palestine
Yeah,
technical
yeah.
difficulties. I I've never seen anything like it. Oh, hey, there we go. Thank you, Telegram. Uh, this is uh,
This is so
I hope
crazy.
you guys think this is as funny as we do, or else this is going to look like a complete waste of time in terms of the time it's taken me to get Telegram up. And keep in mind, this is not a live show, so this is less excusable. But you know what? I like these things uncensored, so I refuse to edit anything that won't get me banned from YouTube. So let's go ahead and get this up right here. So we will save this right. Okay,
It's so crazy.
this is the first time I've actually taken the time to read the Putin caption. In which case, that is amazing. So let me just get this up here.
So unironically, there have been all kinds of people blaming Putin for this, that he, including Zelensky, he did this. Podolyak. There have been some Westerners. He's behind this. I'm with you. So I like. In
Okay,
2022.
here's the meme. I'm sure it's not as funny as we think it is, but this is what we've been giggling like schoolgirls about for the past five minutes here. Operation Giro de Bor. Oy vey. Um,
And
it,
then F off boomer, nobody cares.
in all seriousness, as you were saying,
Yeah, so okay, so Hamas did visit Moscow twice in 2022, right? And now I'm going to lead to something. And of course, you know, maybe Iran isn't unhappy about what is happening. We don't know. Also, understand that the Pentagon and a lot of the Western press, Washington Times, New York Times, all of them are saying there's no evidence that. So even if there was, the U.S. doesn't want you to think that there was. So either it wasn't, or the U.S. is saying it's not relevant, or it didn't happen anyways, so forth and so on, right? Okay. Um, Here's what I personally think is going on. Now, in August, there was a meeting. Biden went to India. Uh, bin Salman was there, right? Mohammed bin Salman, MBS. And, a few weeks later, we saw diagrams of a new trade corridor that would go from the Persian Gulf. Um, I don't know if it would start with Qatar or not, or United Arab Emirates, but it would go across Saudi Arabia into Jordan, then into Israel.
yeah, we showed
It would
the
terminate in
graphic of
Haifa.
that with a few weeks back, and then
Yeah.
then from Haifa it would go into more of the ports out of Greece, in which case it would be carried by rail to the rest of Europe.
Yes. Okay. So that corridor, it was being touted by the Western press. Not the most exciting story for most people. They don't care about this stuff. I'm just saying that in mainline newspapers in the West, like that article, those articles existed. They were published, right? So my personal theory is that all these alliances can disintegrate in maybe not in no time, but quickly. Like you say, like let's just go back to the origins of Hamas, right? So the Israelis began funding Hamas in the 80s as an answer to the PLO, Yasser Arafat's group, okay, who were closely aligned with the Soviets, right? And it was the same basic premise that the Americans used in Afghanistan: get a group that is religiously motivated against a secularist group. Okay. And so that's why they funded the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight against the Afghan government that was on the side of the Soviets and so on. And it's the same story here, right? Um, and in Iran, in some respects, is a reverse of that. But that's another story because it's too much to get into. So the funding went on, and after Yasser Arafat died, the Palestine only had two elections, and it lost the second election to Hamas, but it refused to relinquish power. Now, George Bush Jr. he cut funding off for the PLO, or the group that was used to be the PLO. However, arms were given to the PLO both by Israel and by America. I'm guessing that the reason they cut off like funding for the state, like for the leadership, had to do with them not relinquishing the power, but secretly they wanted them to defeat Hamas at this point, right? Because Arafat was dead, and there wasn't really much that his group could do anymore. So that didn't work out because in 2007, Hamas defeated the PLO. I think at this point they were going by a different name, but essentially they won. And it was after this that Hamas became like a threat, right? Um, my guess is that If Israel is, because think about it, Saudi Arabia and Egypt are going into BRICS. Saudi Arabia wants to have the best position possible. So if it's the Suez Canal or whether it's this new Indian corridor, they want to have the best of both, right? And this is what I mean about alliances can be shattered. For the moment, Saudi Arabia is on the side of the Palestinians. Almost every Muslim country is, except of course the Uyghurs. The
Boigevalt.
Uyghur government in exile has stated, and of course the Azeris have stated their support for so Kosovo, Albania, the Uyghurs, and Azerbaijan have all stated their support for Israel. It's hilarious. It's so hilarious,
You
right?
know, minus the Turks, it would just be a Turkic coalition in support of the co-ethnics, the Ashkenazis. I'm
So
never gonna shut up about that one. I hope you people
you're never
understand
gonna.
that.
I know. I've come to accept it, right? Um, we got to meet again with my brother because you guys would just laugh about this endlessly. Anyhow, um, so what I'm saying is I think basically what Israel is preparing for is they want a corridor where they never have to worry about terrorist attacks on this supply route. That's my bet. That's what they're afraid of. Now, Haifa, of course, is well north of Ascalon. I think it's even north of Tel Aviv. Okay,
Yes.
but the railway system might edge close to the Gaza Strip. Certainly, the West Bank it will. So I think that might be playing a role here, right? That a lot of this has to deal with the Indian quarter. Of course, India is staunchly supporting Israel in this. Um,
Just go
anyways,
on Twitter and you'll
it's just
understand.
something it's just something to consider. Again, nobody is saying in any authoritative way from any authority in the West that this was Iran's doing. Yeah, you have blowhards like Lindsey Graham, but he's always going to say stupid shit like that, right? Um, but I'm saying, the Biden administration so far hasn't said anything like this, right? Not to my knowledge, none of the big Western papers
Not
in
even
London or New York
not
are
even
saying anything
Netanyahu
like
has
that.
said this.
Yes, that's right. Yes, I completely forgot about that. So maybe this is just like a political ploy. It's like, yeah, we support the Palestinians. Yeah, get rid of Hamas. That could be it. That could be it. Did Saudi Arabia ever want normalization talks? I don't know, because Saudi Arabia is in a very powerful position now, right? Like, why would they need to seek out? Like, why would they end normalization talks just because of what is happening here? It's not just because I get it, but it seems like maybe a strong thing to do. Now they have a population that feels strongly about Jerusalem. It is their third holiest site after Mecca and Medina. So that's a pretty big deal. They do have empathy, and a lot of these countries, of course, they no longer accept Palestinian refugees. Um, so it's a difficult situation. They might genuinely want a resolution to this, but I think, to your first point about was this orchestrated or not? I mean, I'm on the fence about it. My brother thinks it was most likely allowed to happen. I have read through a few theories with him about and then we've sort of brainstormed. The best theory I've seen for the case that this was not intentional is the use of new tactics the by the Hamas militants, right? So yes, some of them made it over the wall using paragliders. Okay. How many? I don't know. Is that enough? So I'm just, I'm being speculative here.
I mean,
Yes, there were
maybe as a
very well.
spearhead against a weakly defended position, but
Yes. Now, Netanyahu also took between 60 to 80% of the forces around the Gaza Strip to the West Bank, to Jerusalem. There were fears that something in Jenin, Jerusalem, or Hebron would ignite, right? But the big one that for me was a giveaway, and I didn't say it last week because I mean, in all honesty, I just thought it was a funny story. But when this happened in the Gaza Strip, it's the first thing I thought of, and that is last week the Palestinians stole a Merkava tank. How did they steal a Merkava tank? That's not an easy, like, if there was no bloodshed, that would mean the Israelis just left the Merkava tank. These guys went in, and they I don't know how you start a tank. They had keys, I don't know, and they drove it away from the area where they took it, and then they destroyed it. That's bold, right? How did they do that? I mean, that happened like a week before this happened, so now it's like 10 days old. Okay. um this story, but it's the first thing I thought of. So the tactics that they used, they had FPV drones that blew out the 50 millimeter machine guns that they're on these towers. There's no people manning these guns. It's all remote. The Israelis have all kinds of sensing devices everywhere to detect movement. I watched one show where they mentioned that a bug landing close would be noticed, it would be detected. This woman describes being in the IDF and being woken up at night because an indicator would go on that something had been breached even though it was just an insect, right? So some of these sensors were, I saw video footage of this, were blown out with some kind of like sniper fire, and with the machine guns were taken out with FPV drones. I saw videos of that as well. And this is what facilitated them going in. To be honest, like they were not very well fortified, right? And uh, not just the men, but the women seemed really young, especially the women. The women, they're not women, they're girls. Like these girls to me look like 17, 18 years old, very scrawny. Like they're going to put up a fight. Like there's videos of them, like, yeah, they'll go into the eastern quarter of Jerusalem and shove Muslims and Christians and throw them to the ground, but they won't. Like I've also seen videos where they're like crying because there's some kind of a mob, and one member of the mob slaps them, and they're in tears. Um, so when you look at 60 to 80% are taken away. Remember that the Hamas set up. Look, I'm not trying to convince the audience that this is what happened, right? Because as I keep talking, even I'm realizing just like how ridiculously incompetent of Israeli intelligence this would have to be. But let me move on. The Hamas had set up a mock Israeli settlement or kibbutz inside the Gaza Strip and used it to practice taking over one of these places. I mean, that just makes you wonder, like, did they not survey them? Was it just hubris after so many years and they were never able to, do anything? I don't know. Can it be explained so simply as that? I mean, I understand your hesitancy to believe, right?
yeah, I
That
mean
things went according just as
it's one of those things where either it was allowed to happen or it was such a an intelligence failure, such a security failure that there's really no winning answer for the Israeli state right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also, the fighting has, like, we're not getting everything. This is far more televised than televised, or it's more recorded than the war in Ukraine. But the Israelis have lost, they've lost several high-ranking senior officers, at least four right now. I had their names. I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can find them in time. If you want to entertain the audience with something while I look.
This is a very dangerous time to leave me unattended. I hope you should I hope you should understand. You heard our pre-show conversations. You and our resident whoever's bugging us, whether that's FBI, CIA, Mossad, they got to hear my interesting opinions. In which
Yeah.
case, I
Well,
will try to
here's
express
one.
some of those, but I have to be careful.
The
But as you were saying,
Yeah, so the head of the Shar Na Negev Settlement Council in Gaza Strip was killed by them on the first day, just in the opening hours. Um, there is also rumors that Hamas captured an Israeli general, Nimrod Aloni, from the Gaza division. He's the commander for the Gaza division. Um, Now, I had a much fuller list from a day or two ago. However, another general has been killed since. There was also uh, a police chief that was killed in one of the towns. So what I'm saying is that these guys moved very, very rapidly, and very effectively. Of course, the number one thing I thought of, like after the first hour, because I was up like at 2 a.m. The next day was a holiday, so I didn't have to go to sleep or anything. But I saw what was happening, and I just could not sleep. So, Brigadier, um, yeah, commander of the Nahal Brigade, the late Lieutenant Johann Steinberg, or Jonathan Steinberg, he was killed at Karem Shalom settlement. So this thing moved very, very quickly, and now there were at least 10 other junior officers, guys in their 20s, because the age of the officers was given. It was a South Front article that appeared. Um, the one of Jonathan Steinberg is probably the most famous one, because he was 42 years old, and like he was part of some crack unit. Yeah, Palestinian resistance has assassinated Itamar, or Major Or Yosef of the elite Mistaravim, the undercover unit 217. So there you have another one. Then there was an Israeli, Eliyahu Harush. I believe he was some kind of he was a police chief, young guy, also killed. So the fighting must have been extremely intense and very deadly for many of these guys. Um, so these guys were very well rehearsed. Here's another one, Colonel Roy Levy. You see where I'm going, right? This
yeah,
guy is older than you, younger than me. Okay. Um, yeah. So, anyways, so yeah. Commander of Communications Battalion of Israel's Gaza Division, Sahar Malouf. So this guy was in the same division as Steinberg. So I did read that, like, this division got just annihilated, right? Like when your colonels are dying, like it's a bad situation, right? Because they're usually not right at the
yeah,
front.
absolutely.
They're being overrun. That's what that tends to
Yeah, like
indicate.
when your staff officers are casualties, then you are. I mean, to put it in perspective, the largest war since the end of World War II, that being Ukraine, which we dedicated the first hour and a half, well, first hour to the show to. Uh,
Mm,
I mean, you've had some cases of like high-ranking officers being captured and KIA, but over the course of what let's see, that's 20 21 months, uh,
yeah.
a fraction of high-ranking officers on both sides of this war, mind you, have
Hmm.
had the same capture KIA rate than what happened over a weekend in Israel.
Yeah. 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 I don't know if you want to get into it. Because well, I guess it's not. I don't know. There are people, for instance, I'm in a chat that's like, Muslims again, so bad. Um, they're going, how come the truckers were labeled as Nazis? And to be fair, that's what they said when the Junca thing happened. And they get thrown in jail. They're not released after like 6 months. Their livelihood is taken away. Their bank accounts are frozen, and like nothing happens to this guy, right? And so they use the same logic. Like, how come you have all these accounts that are associated with Hamas? Why doesn't Twitter do something about it? Like, you know, I don't know. Like, because like if you haven't noticed, there's a policy, right, that wars happen in the Middle East, and the refugees from the Middle East go to Europe,
Oh yeah,
right? And
that's how it works. The
oh,
same
like,
people that the Israelis are flattening the homes of, these same Israeli NGOs resettle them
yes,
in Berlin, in London, in
yeah,
Paris, in New York, in Toronto. It's a well-oiled machine, as it were, because
yeah,
when they take their action, when they have their fun, when they go on their adventures, the cleanup is left in the hands of their sponsors. And if they try to do anything, it's you can't do that. You have the same NGOs that they run coming out and denouncing them for all sorts of bigotry and racism, for emulating certain figures from the Second World War, etc.,
mm,
etc. And I'll come out and say it: pure bias on my part, pure ethnic bias on my part. What happened in Lampedusa a month ago with the landing of 10,000 migrants on the southern shores of Italy, I say is far more egregious than what happened in Israel and Palestine this weekend. Now, there were less there was less bloodshed, admittedly, but once again, this is part of a sustained campaign of millions of outsiders coming to Europe, displacing the locals economically, ethnically, and culturally,
yeah,
and they're going to stay. I mean, there's a reason why. I mean, what's the Arab population of somewhere like Tel Aviv? It has to be in the single digits, I would imagine. Now, somewhere like Jerusalem, these places on the border
oh
of the
yeah. The
Palestinian
West
Authority
Bank
are
is
going to have
predominantly
yeah,
predominantly Arab.
yes, yes. So in those parts, yeah, you're probably going to have higher Arab population. But in places like Haifa and Tel Aviv, what do you think the Arab population is? It's
Yeah, it's
I
pretty
I,
low.
I wager in the single digits in terms of
Hmm.
percentage. But with that being said, I will reiterate that they're trying to force us, that being people living in European and North American countries, into accepting a false dichotomy. Either we can be along with the decolonizer leftists and talk about, well, the Palestinians have a right to their nation, but the West is diverse for everyone, or we could be like the Zionist right and say, well, Israel has the right to defend itself, but our nations are for everyone. And once again, they
Yeah,
want to force us into this. Either the Zionists are the worst people in the world, or the Palestinian Muslims are the worst people in the world. But what they fail to tell you, especially, and I'm referring more to the compromised right wing in this term because I've seen it going around.
yeah.
And once again, like
In
I
Canada, it's the Ezra
yeah,
Levant
uh, I.
right wing.
I will get into my, and I'm sure you've all heard my personal thoughts on the entire Palestinian question, as it were. But once again, you have these people talking about it's like, oh, well, they want to do this to you. It's like, Yeah, okay, I agree. You look at the way they behave in Western countries. You look at the what happened in Paris over the summer. But
Yeah,
once again, I will ask the question: who put them here?
yeah, yeah.
And once again,
I
I'm,
I
I'm not even
remember.
talking about the diaspora at this point, because of course the
Yeah,
diaspora, someone like Barbara Lerner Specter, whatever her name is, they're complicit. Once again, the diaspora, in cooperation with Israeli NGOs, are the reason they are here.
remember that cringe video from a few couple of years ago? Again, it was the southern border, and this is fat, ugly Jewish woman who's giving a speech. It's at night, camera lights fixed on her. Today, 1,600 rabbis agreed on something. Everybody, ha ha ha. I know, right? For once, 1,600 rabbis agreed. And what was it? Unlimited immigration, unlimited refugee status to anybody who come. Yeah, of course they agreed on that, right? Um, Look, Netanyahu said that Hamas is ISIS. It's like, yeah, you funded ISIS. Like you ISIS. Even the Charlie Hebdo attacks, right? Two of those members fought for ISIS, right? One of them was wounded, and your Israelis took care of them.
Oh, and
They
that's what the
gave them
Israelis
medical
love to.
attention. Even Vice News reported on this.
That's what the Israelis love to say is some sort of moral superiority. Oh, look at how the Palestinians treat Israelis, but we give medical aid to their militants and terrorists and then send them to Syria as if that's some sort of noble act. That's
Yeah, give me a break.
yeah,
You
like
got your blowback, like whatever. And for the record, ISIS has never intentionally attacked Israel.
the
The
one
one
time they
time they
did, yeah.
did, they apologized, and it was some stupid bomb that was intended for Lebanon, but it landed on the Israeli side. Like, big deal. I mean, no one was even harmed. It literally landed in some farmer's field. Um, the one time you're talking about an organization that's been around for um, what, 10 years now? Now, since 2000, summer of
Yeah, and
2014.
they still run rampant in eastern Syria. Now it's a fraction of what it used to be, but it's still there. And
Yeah,
with
they're
is
protected by the
yeah,
U.S.
with Israeli arms and American arms, as I'm sure you all know. And once again, I always love to dive back into history when it comes to these sort of things. As I was with some the Russian-Ukrainian conflict just about an hour ago, and I will reiterate. Now I know our audience. I know the makeup of our audience, and I think it's fair to say most of us here are Christians of various denominations, as it were. So I'll give an example that speaks both to Eastern and Western Christendom. When Constantinople fell, when the Muslim Ottoman Turkish armies marched in, do you know who they put in charge as middle management? You'll never
Yeah,
guess. They put the Jewish population of Constantinople and of the former Byzantine Empire in these positions, in these bureaucratic positions. They got to maybe not be directly governors themselves, but they got to work under them. They got to be the middleman. They got to enjoy very comfortable lives. Throughout the Ottoman Empire, constantly in the Sultan's ear, he had, they called them donmes. They were, um, as the Westerners would call them, conversos, the outwardly Muslim but still in secret practicing Jewish. And they were some of the most influential people within the Ottoman Empire. And for a Western example, to speak, to our other part of the audience here, who opened the gates of Toledo? Who facilitated the
that's
the,
right.
the the
In
Arab
Spain.
Muslim invasion of Iberia? And
Yeah,
yeah, and guess who got to be middle management of Al Andalus for 700 years?
right.
Yes.
It was them. Now, just to be fair, just to be fair, they did infuriate the Sultan of that caliphate, and he did slaughter 5,000 of them.
Are
But
you are
it
you
was
telling me
because
they are you telling me they pushed their luck with their sponsors? No way.
they did. They did, and they did have to, like, you know, you had to move for a Muslim. If you were a Christian, if you were walking on the street, you couldn't obstruct their path and so on. Um, Look, the show wants to be as fair and knowledgeable as possible, but the overall argument that you're making is it is real, right? Um, that is what happened. Um, very much so in the Ottoman Empire. And of
And
course, the Israelis will never recognize the Armenian genocide.
I will
Uh,
reiterate, in the grand scheme of all of this, the past 1400 years, we are in but a brief pause of a 1400-year alliance between these two people.
yeah, 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 yeah.
And I mean, that's probably the safest I can say on YouTube. I don't know. Maybe if we ever have a Telegram or BitChute exclusive, I could say, let's just say, speak more frankly about this topic, as it were. But I will hold my tongue for now. But we are at a point where they are so audacious about this that
Hmm.
even a lot
Hmm.
of people in the Western world will raise an eyebrow on this. And keep in mind,
Yeah,
Israel used to be a bipartisan issue, especially back in its early establishment post 7 Day War, because at that time people understood Israel just to be yet another secular liberal democracy. That's just what it was, and they really upped the ante after 9/11, talking about our united struggle against Islamic extremism, or whatever weasel words they used for that. But once again, they are pushing their luck. Even right wingers who are work for outlets where are actually obligated to support Israel are being as let's just say tepid about this as possible. They are choosing their words very carefully. Whereas when we moved the embassy to Jerusalem in 2018, or when you had the disputes in 2021, it was whole hog for Israel. Now, of course, you do have that from the usual suspects. That still does exist, but it can conservatives are being a lot more careful with their rhetoric this time, which is actually somewhat encouraging to see. I will say,
yeah,
uh, and like I said, you have your blowhards, but they they're not very eager to touch the issue, and especially after 20 months of Ukraine, they realize that their base is exacerbated with foreign adventures, as it were. But as I was saying, I can't remember. Either I said this on the show or off air. The one thing that could actually generate enthusiasm for foreign intervention, the only thing would have been Israel. And lo and behold, we have that. And
yeah. Another Israeli official said that this is our 9/11. This was, I think,
so it was a
I saw the
mitzvah.
video on the BBC,
Uh,
YouTube BBC, and one of the commentators, oh my God, he just destroyed me. This can't be your 9/11 because there were no dancing Israelis.
I mean,
Ouch.
I you can't disagree. You can't disagree with that one. You just can't. It's just one of those things. It's yeah. I I co-sign it. I gotta say, I co-sign it. Uh, but getting to what will be the long-term implications of this, because when this first started, I expected it to be no different than, say, the unrest we saw in 2018 or 2021, which is very quickly quelled. But every time we've talked about Israel on the show for the past since 2021, really, we've been certain to reiterate that they are in a very unfavorable position when it comes to their both internal and external politics, and that is the Iranians are their chief rival. That is, are in the best position they've been in since the Islamic Revolution. Uh, they've squandered agreements recently with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, once again, is also, and the Gulf states in general, are in comprehensive talks with the Iranians, and that has yet to be derailed. Uh, Turkey, who was actually a country that was actually on very good terms with Israel up until very recently. I mean, mind you, when Erdogan was facing down the coup, the reason he was able to give the broadcast that he did from his plane was because of Israeli assistance. They gave him the uplink in order to broadcast to the Turkish public. So they actually bailed him out in 2016. But a lot of those bridges have been burned now that Turkey is in a, let's just
Hmm.
say, much more maneuverable position for their own interests. And You have, like I said, Egypt is very careful. It walks tightrope. It's very satisfied with the status quo as it is, from all sides. The Jordanians, it will go whichever the way the wind blows. That's just the way they are. But and then of course you do have Syria, which is still recovering from civil war. That still does have, as we had mentioned earlier, events like the drone attacks on the military academy that we did see last week. So Syria is also very pinned down in itself, to the point where, in terms of any like state action against Israel, it's probably not going to happen. But then you do have Hezbollah, which is coming home with more than 10 years experience in the Syrian civil war, on top of their previous success over Israel in 2006, and on top of actually success in the skirmishes. I believe it was, what was it, 2018, 2019. You actually did have an event where they Hezbollah were able to rout an Israeli incursion into southern Lebanon to a substantial degree, to the point where the Israeli state didn't even grandstand on it. They just denied that it happened. That was that embarrassing. It was too embarrassing for them to even use for victim points. That's how bad it was. In which case, you've had instances like that over the past few years where they will do that. I don't know. Maybe we'll get some more strikes on, just in general, more strikes on Damascus airport, because that's the only way Israel knows how to lash out now. I mean, and
Speaking of airports, we should say that Gaza used to have an airport till the Israelis destroyed it, and
I'm shocked.
it was because um, because of an embargo, the Palestinians there could not rebuild any of the buildings that had been destroyed. So they went to the airport and gathered whatever materials they could salvage, and that's what they used for reconstruction. Like the thing is like I'm not one of those people who say that they like I've seen the videos, okay? Like Hamas has done like very, very brutal stuff. They really have. It's not. I don't know. It's not like a lie. It's not fake news. You will. I have seen stories where they have spared the lives of women and children. I've seen stories where they haven't. Like I'm just saying that it's more nuanced than that, and I just that should be mentioned is their lives are horrible. They can't just get out. It's like it's a subsistence existence for them, and it's not even much of that. Um, I don't know. It, this conflict, I think, to me, doesn't seem resolvable. Um, you know, I don't know what to say. I think the Israelis want a situation where the Palestinians will have to decide whether they want to live or not whether they want to keep their land. And
Yes.
just for the record, I it's a long story, but I had a friend whose family was Christian Palestinian, and they were booted off. So you know, um, I have knowledge about how that went down. That that's firsthand because I spoke with their father. This is many years ago, so for the
Yeah.
record.
Um, I can't say I know anyone personally, but I have heard the stories of the Palestinian diaspora, particularly of the Christian diaspora, who, once again, are, to nobody's shock, predominantly either Catholic or Orthodox, just because of
Yeah,
the region they're in. And with that being said, somebody made this comparison about, once again, the two major wars going on right now. I suppose this one is more recent, but to also harken back to what I was saying about the towns and villages that are being traded back and forth between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Barring some radical Galician nationalists, Russians and Ukrainians as people are capable of coexistence, regardless of the victor. Now, like I said, because of current circumstances, there might be a brutal crackdown, especially from the Ukrainian side as they go back into these villages. But a broad timeline, Russians and Ukrainians have proven themselves capable of a somewhat peaceful coexistence because they're largely like culturally, religiously. I know. Look. I understand the situation of the church, but just speaking broad brushstrokes. And even when it comes to how intermixed they are, when it comes to marriages, people have family on both sides of that border, as it is. Israelis and
Mhm.
Palestinians are incapable of coexistence, and that's not a statement as an endorsement of one way or another. That's just an objective statement because you had these populations that have been there. Now, look, yeah, I know the Arabs aren't indigenous to the Palestinian land or whatever. The point being is, you had the Arabs come in, intermix with the locals who, in antiquity and ancient times were Jewish, became Christian. Most of them ended up becoming Muslim, as the flow of history goes. And then you have these Ashkenazis predominantly Ashkenazis from the diaspora, who show up in the 30s and 40s as quote unquote, well, I guess, yeah, they were refugees. I'm not going to deny that. The situation in Europe was not favorable to them in any circumstance. Like, look, regardless of my personal feelings, I'm not going to pretend like nothing happened in Europe in the 1930s and 40s, okay?
Yeah, yeah, of
Um,
course.
so, yes, they did genuinely show up as refugees, assisted mainly by the British. Now, of course, you had the Balfour Declaration, and you had the British promising this land to all these different people, just really trying to uh, balance its interests in the region. Now, mind you, these same refugees would later form paramilitary and even terrorist groups to drive out the British mandate. And I mean, it's pathetic when the most successful government in the past 100 years is from the waning British Empire. And look, I mean, I don't despise the British Empire, but I certainly don't like them. I think everyone knows where I stand on that question. But point being is, the British Mandate looks like a very functional, competent government compared to everything that has come before and after in the past. I would say 120 years. But like I said, that's aside the point. So I guess you could say that the Zionists themselves are decolonizers. Disgusting, uh, but
Yeah, I mean, also it should be noted how many British soldiers and British officials were killed due to um, Israeli and Jewish terrorism
oh,
that
absolutely.
preceded the official formation of the Israeli
I
state.
mean, the IDF and the Mossad both have their origins as part of these paramilitary and terrorist organizations, and
Yeah.
that's really what it comes down to. But point being is, you have these groups that show up here less than a century ago, and then completely overhaul the land and completely displace the locals there. You have a series of wars fought over it. Point being is, the enmity between these two people show that only one can really stand when it comes to this. There's no two-state
Hmm.
solution. There's not even a one-state solution where everyone's given full citizenship in order to participate in whatever, because the Israelis will never allow that. The Palestinians have a higher population growth rate, and it's not going to be a burden they're going to want to take on. I mean, you had apprehensions about reuniting Germany. You had apprehensions because of the disparity of the two populations about Germany reuniting with its own co-ethnics. You have these concerns about Korea with the disparity in technology progress and standards of living. No way are you going to combine that with an embittered ethnic and religious conflict. It's just not going to happen. So one of the sides has to go, really. In which case, I'll be honest, I'm not some sort of Islamophile. I don't think I need to tell anyone this. I think they can listen to my rhetoric for the past 5 years on the show. But, I mean, let's be honest. And we're going to actually see this. I think we're going to actually see this. The more liberal elements of Israeli Jews will go to places like New York. They'll go to places like maybe not so much London nowadays. London's kind of going to hell, but they will go to prosperous Western cities where they can live in safe, gated communities. And you know what? Everyone would have been fine with that if they would have just
Remember when
shut up about it.
Netanyahu was telling Jews to leave to leave France because it was too unsafe after Charlie Hebdo.
Yeah, yeah,
You remember that shit?
I
That
remember
was that's funny.
they've been agitating this for years, and who knows? Maybe after some sort of peace agreement is struck in Ukraine, they will try to rebuild the new Israel in the former Pale of Settlement
Nah.
to bring that back that old one that I've also been harping on. Now, once again, I don't believe that, but things do more things than I'm comfortable with point to that being a possibility. Like I said, I'm not going to co-sign that. I'm not going to say it's going to happen, but it's more possible than you would think it is. Once again, I'll reiterate that I'm not predicting that. But I don't know. May even have some of these quote unquote based Eastern European states that try to court them, like Poland or I. I doubt Hungary at this point. Hungary's in a very precarious situation, but I don't know. Maybe as you get more of these controlled op right wing governments, they might try to offer refuge if the situation in Israel does become more unfavorable. But point being is, I think we're going to see a mass exodus of liberal Israeli Jews to most likely the United States and just North America in general, but predominantly the United States. And that's going to leave Israel in the hands of even more hardliner right wing governments, people who uh, actually run to the right of Netanyahu, as it were. And that's only going to inflame the situation because these people are fully dedicated to a one state solution in favor of the Israeli side to the explicit detriment to the Palestinians. And uh, I will say once again, you have right wing Israeli politicians and just right wing Israelis in general saying that send all the Arabs to Europe, they deserve it for how they treated us for all these centuries, blah, 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 blah. And
To Europe. No kidding,
yeah,
eh?
and look, you could say that's just rhetoric, you could say that's just trolling, but I I'm not saying that it would be something they would explicitly have to do because of some sort of resentment, but if they had the option to send every single Palestinian to Europe so they could have their,
They would.
yeah, they would, and yeah, I'm not going to deny that,
Now,
um,
I'll be honest with you. I'll be honest with you. I know people of like Jewish or partly Jewish ancestry, and they would not want that.
yeah, like I said, I'm not even
They
saying it's
wouldn't.
widespread.
They would not be on board with that.
Yeah, I'm not even saying it's widespread, but I'm saying that
Yeah.
elements of that do exist, but there
Yes. Yes, we
they
do.
there are elements in Israel just in general who would be willing to send the Palestinians anywhere in the world if it meant having the land to themselves. In which case, I don't think they'll achieve quite that, but I I certainly see the disillusion of Gaza being a real possibility in the future, putting Gaza under full occupation. Now, what are the optics of that going to look like? Who knows? But and then you're going to have an even more beleaguered West Bank with uh, I can't remember the name of the current party in power in the West Bank, but once again, the people under Abbas are going to be stronger in rhetoric, but weaker in action, as it seems. Because I mean, that's just the story of the West Bank. Just it's being slowly chipped away. None of the surrounding Arab states are going to be willing to accept the Palestinians, especially after what we had seen in the Lebanese civil war, where it where because they had the audacity to even let the Palestinians in, uh, Israel came knocking, as it were, because oy vey, you can't do that. You know the usual stories. So
Like on the one hand, they say can't they go to Arab states, and then on the other hand, they can't. Like, it makes no sense.
yeah, like I said,
They're
but
thinking like send them to Malaysia or something. Like,
Malaysia, yeah, yeah. They want to send them. They want their own Madagascar plan, as it were.
yeah,
Yeah, they'll deport them anywhere in the world. And look, I know this has largely been the case, but any Palestinian with the means to go to a more prosperous and stable country will get out in the next 5 years, as it were, leaving just the absolute bottom of the barrel in terms of people who, over the past 70 years, have not had the means to get out. Because I mean, there's already a massive Palestinian diaspora in both the Arab Muslim world and the West as a whole. I mean, it's
yeah. There's a big one in Canada, particularly in Ottawa. You can find many there, especially the Christians that were booted out in the
oh yeah,
50s
yeah.
and 40s.
It's it's going to be one of those things where they are going to be a much like the Armenians, the Palestinians are going to be a people who have a larger diaspora than they do in their homeland, and they're going to be embedded because of that, and they're likely going to be a. I mean, they arguably already are stateless people, but that's going to be cemented within the next 5 years if Israel is allowed to continue. And I suppose the final topic I'll bring up, because it is a bit fringe, it is, I guess one would say, a bit controversial, and it's interesting to speculate on. Do you think they're going to try to rebuild the third temple after all of this?
I mean, I think that there's proponents, but maybe we're not there yet. I mean, it's the situation. First of all, is very fluid right now, right? You have conflicting reports about how the Israelis have managed to recapture all the villages or part of the villages, and then you find out that they're still fighting on the outskirts of Ascalon, right? Um, Sderot is still apparently like there's fighting there. Like it's very fluid. I think maybe we're going like see, I remember when the Iraq war was going on, having discussions, especially with this one shitlib I knew, and I said this is the most important contested piece of property in the world. It just is, and you don't have to be like a religious Jew. I certainly don't believe Benjamin Netanyahu is a religious Jew, but you don't have to be one to understand how important it would be if that if the sacrifices, because of course they came out with the red heifer years ago, no blemishes, no white spots,
And
all
they
red,
actually even tried it. There was a case this year where they tried. Oh, they found the red heifer in Texas.
Stupid Zio American Christians breeding them to hell.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that's pretty much what Christian Zionism is. That they're trying to accelerate. Like they're the ultimate accelerations. They want to bring about the end times. It's
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
it's a religion based on accelerationism.
Yeah, I mean, part of it, the reason they're like that, okay, is because they're not the Catajon, and so they're not the Catajon. They're that's a funding that's an important principle in
Yeah.
Orthodoxy. So they know they're not that. They've lost control of the culture, right? And so now they just want to accelerate, the end times, and really because they have no rights, rights, and a Eucharist and a liturgy, because they don't have that. Like a lot of this, very novel late 19th century eschatology is the way that gives them something vital. Like the Jews represent like the Word of God made flesh, and a dual covenant theory and all of that stuff, right? Like I mean, when I come across it, I just like, and I'm in disagreement. If I bring up 70 A.D. and the destruction of the temple, as foretold by our Lord, and especially in Matthew, um, they, I just tell them, I go, listen, I'm not an American Christian. I'm not a Zio Christian. I'm not like a non-denominational Protestant Christian, dude. Like, I wasn't raised that way. When I came back to the church after a long absence. That's not like I've literally never been like that. So you go ahead, you believe what you want to believe, but I certainly don't. You're never going to convince me.
Yeah, but like I said, I would agree with you that the time is not now. That something very cataclysmic would have to happen before they once again before they decide to kick off the end times, as it were. Because that's what the third temple. Oh, I will let you know that if they do announce that they are building the third temple. I hate to say it, the show will be disbanded effective immediately, and I will be fleeing to the nearest monastery in the mountains. Okay, and I'm sure you, my friend, have a similar escape plan in that regard. But once again,
Yeah, oh yeah,
I will give
sure
that.
I do.
This is not my advice. This is the advice of Jesus Christ. Well, no, actually, excuse me, the command of Jesus Christ that when they do rebuild the third temple, run to the hills. That's quite quite literally. I'm not. Once again, I'm not my words, the words of the Lord. Flee to the hills when that happens. And
Yeah.
you also look at the explanation and teaching of these words by many saints of at least the Orthodox Church, or I should say the Church. And once again, I know we have not a lot of non-Orthodox audience, so I try to make these things understandable because I know they're very foreign concepts to a lot of you. But once again, you look at many great saints of the church, they say outright, yeah, that's one of the parts of the scriptures that is quite literal. Flee to the hills, and it's been extrapolated upon. Settle close to a monastery. It's that's what you need to do when it comes to the end. In which case, like I say, I will, in complete earnest, the most earnest I will ever be on the show, is that's what you need. If they 100% swear on my life, if they do actually begin the groundbreaking of the construction of the third temple at the former site of the Alaska Mosque, it's it's quite literally the time.
Yeah.
Now, once again, I'm not saying that'll even happen in my lifetime. I'm not saying that's something that's a possibility. But once again, this is something that could happen at any time, and I do feel it is my duty, like as a actual believing Christian, to tell you people this because, like I said, I know a lot of you. Once again, we're pretty much on the same page with this, but these may be foreign concepts to you, and um, if I can tell at least one person about this, I feel like I've at least have begun to do my part in that regard.
Mhm.
But I suppose just with I know that took a very heavy turn, as it were. To close out with some of this stuff out of Syria, because you had just two very odd events in Syria that we touched on earlier. Um, I would say the first is the skirmish between the U.S. and Turkey in the air, because I mean, to nobody's shock, it's been happening for years now. You had the Turks flying a drone over Syria,
Mhm.
and a U.S. fighter actually shot that drone down. Now, this was a story that was very quickly,
Yes, we should spend
yeah,
some time on Syria.
yeah. But this was a story that very quickly was shut up by both sides. I think you outright had Turkey saying, "Oh, we have confirmation that it is an accident." Now that could be outdated news on my part. I apologize if it is, but that was, I believe, on Wednesday this past week, where Wednesday, Thursday this past week, and then also around the same time, you had the graduation of a Syrian military academy
Hmm.
that was completely swarmed by drones. Now, I believe this was somewhere in. I don't think it was in Damascus. Now, I could be wrong about that. But I believe it was somewhere near the, let's just say, towards the flashpoints in Syria, towards northwestern Syria, Aleppo, Afrin area, where you
Yes.
did have these drone swarms hit this academy graduation of once again officers in the Syrian military. And for those who have been following the Syrian conflict ever since it really tapered out in 2017, 2018, one of the primary actions that we've seen, especially in eastern Syria, is the assassination of Syrian officers in the field. And of course, that affects going back to what we were saying in Israel. That's something that affects the entire chain of command. Now, once again, it's not like they're hitting colonels or like high-ranking staff officers. They are hitting field officers. But point being is that's how it's vital to the chain of command in the field, especially in such an irregular war, to have that sort of thing happen. And that's the reason why eastern Syria has been so hard to stabilize, and that's the reason why it's one of the least stable parts. And we're talking like Deir Zor area, towards like the border of Iraq, where you still have this low level insurgency because they are so embedded, and of course they do have their backers, they have their sponsors, that they can't get a foothold in there because, and it's not even because of conventional military operations or even guerrilla warfare. It's because of just, once again, outright assassinations of field officers in eastern Syria. And I think this is just a next step up in the escalation of this. You still have that. I don't know if they still brand themselves as HTS, but you still do have those pockets of what are or once were HTS operating out of northwestern Syria, and they hit this academy. Not only is this a blow to actual manpower and actual, I suppose you could also say, brain power of the Syrian military, it is completely demoralizing because there were a lot of civilians at this ceremony, as one would expect. With
The number of civilians, women, children is staggering. At first, they said it was just, six children, something, 10 women. No, no, no. I mean, the footage of people still alive, wounded, and in flames. Wow. This was not, I would say at least half of the latest figure from a day or two ago was that 89 people were killed, many injured. And I would say it's safe to say that half, 40% of them, of the 89 were all civilians. I'm being very honest. Um, and I saw the footage like right from the end of the celebration where all the young officers and young cadets are, and as they start to disband, the hit is in an area a little bit away from there, closer to a grandstand. But the other thing that this reminded me of was, the Syrians made like this. There was a point where they made like a lot of gains in 2019, and they were like after a week or two they were being pushed back, and I'm thinking like, what's happening? Why are they being pushed back? And that was when the Turks started to give to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. A lot of these affiliated groups, they're Turkmen, but they're still Al Qaeda affiliated. Um, the good guys in Syria, according to Hillary Clinton. Um, they started using the Bayraktar drone then, and then like a year later, even less than a year, but about a year later, that's when, of course, you had the Azeris start to use them against the Armenians. And now, I'll be honest, the Russians have fortified that area with far more air defense systems than they had at the time. I don't think they were expecting it, right? But this one got through. Uh, they did try a couple of days later again, and it failed. And the Israelis have been actually more ineffective than effective before everything broke out in the Gaza Strip.
yes, absolutely, and I do think that when it came to civilian casualties in this recent attack in Syria, civilian casualties there actually, there were more civilian casualties than there were during the recent upset in Israel, as it were. So, and it's like I said, this came out of left field. Syria had mostly been quiet, relatively speaking,
Mm.
up until this happened. And I mean, I think it would be strange to say these two events aren't connected somehow. Now, perhaps I'm reaching
Yes,
too
yes.
much, but I have a hard time believing that these are just two parallel events with no influence or no sort of a
Mm.
common source as it is.
Right. I did have those thoughts too. I don't know what the connection is. Now, Pashinyan has been saying that he fears that Azerbaijan will now go through Armenian proper territory. This is not Nagorno-Karabakh. This is not the area that the Armenians fought over with the Azeris and defeated the Azeris and took that land in the 90s, or the time in 2018 where they successfully defended against the Azeris. This is that long part at the bottom of Armenia that goes down and connects with what country? Iran. But on the west side of it is a sliver of Azerbaijani territory. And now he's saying, oh, Azerbaijan is going to take this bottom part. Well, your friends, the Americans and the French are there. Surely they'll stop them. But are they? Are they going to stop them? I don't know. I know the Americans are not happy with the Turks, destroying their Kurdish proxies. The Turks this week hit three refineries for oil that the Kurds and the Americans steal from Syria and bring it over into Iraq. But you have to think like Iran is on good terms with Armenia, and Iran said that this is a red line, right? Because that would destroy any connection between Armenia and Iran. Pashinyan's traitorousness is much bigger than people suspect. It's not just Nagorno-Karabakh.
I
He
mean,
wants to destroy
I've outright
the country's relationship with Armenia as well. I
uh,
mean, with Iran.
I've outright said, and this is a very high bar considering the people in power in the West right now. Nicole Pashinyan is the biggest traitor to his nation alive today, and
Yeah.
I say that with knowledge of people like Joe Biden and people, I suppose, formerly in office, people like Merkel or Macron or Theresa May. I still maintain that uh, Nicole Pashinyan is the biggest traitor to his nation alive today because, look, they all did horrible things. They have all sold their countries down the river, and perhaps put in similar situations, they would have done much the same. But point being is, we're actually witnessing him take these actions in real time. We're actually witnessing
Mm-hmm.
him play an active part in this. This isn't a man who has been outmaneuvered politically and is bad at his job. No, this is somebody who is completely
Yeah.
complicit in the dismantling of his nation, of his ancient nation, we should say, and his people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's disgusting.
Like, if I the fact that he's an ethnic Armenian and not like using Armenian identity as a cover for certain other identities, I
Mm.
that's one of the most shocking things I figured out about this man. The fact that he is that much so. But what does he care? Because he knows at the end of this, if all else fails, he'll get the golden parachute and he'll get to run the NGO with Zelensky and Saakashvili.
Yes.
That's
That's how
that's
these
what he's
people
banking
fail
on.
up.
Yeah, it's they'll get to be Newland's advisory council. They'll get to go to all these events and they'll get to give these speeches and they will make millions of dollars for it and live comfortable lives while their people suffer and die because of their treasonous actions. And that's really all it comes down to. And like I said, Pashinyan is the greatest traitor to his nation alive today, and I don't really think there's anyone who can compete with him in that regard. And like I said, very high bar, but I still think he takes the title on that.
Hmm. Yeah, I can imagine Pashinyan running into Kasparov in Brooklyn.
uh, yeah, that would
What are
be.
you doing here? What are you doing here?
Uh, isn't that just an NPR podcast in the making?
You're right. You're right.
I and that's once again, that is these people's plan B. That is the retirement plan. As you said, this is how they fail up. They get to go on this. They get to have their talk shows. They get to have the interview appearances. They get to appear on NPR and on New York Times, and all these different things. And like I said, Armenia be damned, Russia be damned, Ukraine be damned, Georgia be damned. It they get to live comfortable lives as rootless Westerners. Once again, although, and look, I know Kasparov and Zelensky may be exceptions here, but in terms of somebody like Saakashvili and Pashinyan, um, when it comes to their actions, they are spiritually part of that certain ethno-religious group. It's they're no better. In fact, I would say they're worse because they're not part of that yet. They behave in a same manner, and
Mm.
I would say, and I know this might be controversial to some elements of our audience. There are more honorable Jews alive today than men like Nicole Pashinyan. And
Oh yeah.
Benjamin Netanyahu is more honorable than Nicole Pashinyan. And you all full well know my opinions on Netanyahu. Yeah, and I say that unequivocally because
Mm.
say what you will about him, but he is a dyed-in-the-wool Zionist, dyed-in-the-wool Israeli nationalist. As much as I may oppose him on that, you can't take that. You can't take it away that he is loyal to his people and his ethnos, and that um, I don't know. Maybe when push comes to shove, he might do it, but I actually don't see him taking the golden parachute NGO. To his credit, like I said, that doesn't mean I have to like the guy, but there's a certain base level of respect you can have for something like that. And
Hmm.
these people are scum. They will, if the truth is allowed to prevail, they will go down in history as terrible men. Once again, some of the worst in their nation's histories, and there's really not much else you can say about them.
Yeah.
But unless you had any last minute stories, that's all I had.
No, that's all I have to for now.
Well, that was a fun episode. Yeah, it is one of those episodes. By the end of it, you really look into like, wow, that like all that happened this weekend. I don't know.
It's crazy.
This is the first non-Ukraine centric episode we've done in months.
Uh,
Uh,
yeah,
yeah,
probably a few years now.
Yeah, actually, I would say
Yeah.
yes. Since the start of the war, this is the first non-Ukraine centric episode that we had. Which I don't know, it might be a fluke, but it might also be a sign of things to come. In which case, either way, we will be back in a week or so, whenever we can, put together the time to record another episode,
Hmm.
and we will cover everything or the lack thereof that has happened since then. And we'll see you guys next time. And goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.